12-year-old Mackenzie was just a few hours from death after a blister on his foot became infected, all because he was wearing shoes with no socks. At first, the boy's mom thought the blister was a wart and treated it. The next day, his temperature soared and a red rash spread all over his body. Mackenzie went into toxic shock and his organs began to fail, leaving him dangerously close to losing his life.
Wow.
So this is luckily not the common scenario with a foot blister,
right.
But we all know that any blister anywhere in the body can become infected, and when it does so, it could theoretically get in your bloodstream and lead to sepsis. I'll explain that in a moment, but these are scary things, and if we ignore them, which we often do because it's way down there, it'll get better on its own. We don't even look at our feet often. This can progress.
Or people do the exact opposite. They sit on their bed at night, put their foot up, and then they take their foot and just start peeling off it.
Or they chew it
chew it off.
Yeah.
And that's really what ends up
I'm not that flexible, so I can't. But
if you have a blister, the best thing to do is just kind of drain it with something that's sterile, and then leave the skin there. Everybody wants to peel it off.
And the same thing with pimples. People do that with pimples, and pimples can get infected, inflamed, and abscess.
But this is essentially a simple infection that turned life-threatening. Any of my patients that happens, I'm usually going to work up their immune system just to make sure there's nothing underlying that would cause.
Right, this was Staph aureus. This lives on your skin, and this is why we always say be careful with blisters, because if you're rubbing on it and touching it, you're transferring potential bacteria from your hands into the wound. So what happens with sepsis? Well, it can happen with any infection, but let's just say you do have a blister and it becomes infected. If that bacteria gets into your bloodstream, like you're seeing there with those green dots, your body can have this massive inflammatory response where it sends white blood cells, other inflammatory markers, that all ends up in your bloodstream. That's when you start having systemic symptoms, things such as fever, massive drop in your blood pressure. You might develop confusion. Systemic symptoms, you may just think you have the flu. If you have the flu and a skin infection, get worried, because what then happens is with sepsis, this massive inflammatory response, you get end organ failure, respiratory failure, liver failure, kidney failure. You can even develop heart attacks, have heart failure. That's why people die. Their body you can no longer pump enough blood to your vital organs. You can end up literally with brain damage. You can lose limbs. So the key here is this, is if you have a skin infection, whether it's on your foot or elsewhere, and you start to develop systemic symptoms, fevers, that doesn't mean you have sepsis, but it means it's time to go see the doctor.
And it's a redness you can usually see, and it looked like in his wound there was an area of redness, and it starts to spread beyond the wound.
Oftentimes I'll mark the redness with a pen, and then later on that day,
you can monitor how
real quickly.
The thing with infections, too, that you have to keep in mind is that when a loved one just stays in the bed, they haven't gotten up for hours, they're really, really lethargic, you try to wake them up, they're not waking up, that is a sign that things have really gone awry, and you have to get to the emergency room immediately.